Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, based on your time zone. Welcome in Salesforce Epics Hour. My name is Amit Chaudhary. I'm the host and the founder of Epics Hour. Today, we are going to talk about Salesforce user story in action, and we have a great speaker with us, Sudha. So, let me hand over Sudha for her introduction and the presentation.
Thank you, Amit. Happy Mother's Day to all the wonderful women out there. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, based on where you've joined us today. So I'll get started. So today's session is going to be about Salesforce user stories in action. A little about me. My name is Sudha Sundaram. I have 12 plus years of experience, predominantly in the Salesforce and the Agile world. I've coached several organizations in their Agile journey over the last 10 plus years. And in my last position, I was vice president at Citi, managing the program management of the Salesforce programs. And sorry about that. In the Agile world, I have 3 certifications: a certified Scrum professional, certified Scrum master, and a PMI ACP certified professional. And I also have 11 Salesforce.com certifications, including application architect. I'm also a co-founder of Salesforce Couple, which Hamid just mentioned before we got started. So in yesterday's session, we pretty much covered about the basics of Agile and Scrum, right? So we quickly looked about what Waterfall versus Agile was, and what's the basics of Scrum, the Agile mindset, and the Scrum rules, and the Scrum framework overall, right? So in today's session, we are going to take a deep dive into how do we create good Salesforce specific user stories? How do we prioritize them? And how do we estimate these user stories that we create? So based on the Agile, the management framework, and based on a lot of people's guidance, or something that was set up as INVEST criteria. The acronym INVEST stands for independent, negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. So this was a criteria that was set to define good user stories. So what all these great Agile professionals said was, if your user story fits into this INVEST criteria, then it's going to be a good user story, most likely, right? So just to give you a little bit brief of what this INVEST acronym really means. So I stands for independent, and what it really means is the stories that we write should be independent as far as possible. So don't write stories that are too much dependent on other stories, because then what might happen is you will not be able to deliver your user story quickly, right? So it's dependent on a lot more parameters, a lot more user stories. So you're not able to realize your business value quickly. So try to keep them as independent as possible. Like we all know, sometimes it's really hard, not to keep them dependent, because there could be some dependencies, but try to understand if they really need to be a dependency or if you could keep them independent. So keep them as independent as possible. The N in the INVEST stands for negotiable. So whatever stories we write, right, it should be discussable further. So you should be able to have a conversation about the user story. You should be able to brainstorm and discuss about the user story. It should be negotiable, right? So if, for instance, you write a user story, which is like a dead end, right? You're not able to make a conversation on it, you're not able to describe the story, you're not able to debate on the story, then there is something probably wrong with the story, right? Because you can really not have a story that cannot be discussed. So the V in the INVEST criteria stands for valuable. So like I mentioned yesterday, we are trying to eliminate waste, right? And we're trying to focus on what is important. So whatever stories we write, end of the day, should be valuable to the customer. So do not create user stories if you feel there is no value add to the customers. We are not trying to create waste here. We're trying to add value to the customer end of the day. So all the user stories that we create should be valuable to the end customer. And the E in the INVEST criteria stands for estimable. So whatever stories that we write should be, the development team should be able to estimate the stories, right? They should be able to break them down into tasks and further estimate the tasks, and so that they're able to work on it. So the story should be estimable. And the S of the INVEST criteria stands for small. So like I again mentioned yesterday, I was saying, let's not create user stories too big. What we're trying to achieve through Agile is We want to realize the value sooner and faster and incrementally, right? So when you keep the story smaller, it's easier to do that. So do not keep too big a user story. And moving on, the T in the invest criteria, the last acronym stands for testable. So ensure that the user stories that we write can be tested against the acceptance criteria. There should always be room for testing. There's always be room for validation. If you write a story that cannot be tested, then there is some problem with it again. So every time we write a user story, it's good to see if it fits into an invest criteria. Basically, it should be independent, it should be negotiable, valuable, estimable, small, and testable. So now say we understand this concept well now, right? So let's see, what are the three essential parts of a user story? So irrespective of whichever tool you're using in your organization, it could be Jira or TFS or anything else that you're using right now, right? So typically a user story has three essential parts. So the first is a summary, which is typically your user story or your feature name. So though I've written this as a user story creation slide, this is applicable even for your features, not only for user story. So that's why I'm calling out your summary could be your user story or your features name. So basically it's something that you could use to distinguish stories or features between each other, right? And then the second one is your description or your value statement. And the final one is an acceptance criteria. So let's look at each of this in detail now. So summary is usually a crisp statement, right? Like I mentioned, use this only to distinguish your story from another story, right? So an essential tip that I follow and it has been very useful to me is I try to keep the summary as something like this. So I have a feature name shortened if I'm doing this for a user story, and then I write a short story summary. So I want to give you an example here so you're able to relate to what I say better. Say, for example, we have a user story for account management as a feature, right? So what the customer is telling me as a product owner is, I want an ability to, capture account levels. So this is a banking client, and they have multiple different account levels for their customers. They have platinum, they have gold, they have silver, they have bronze. So what they want to do is they want to have the ability to capture these account levels on their accounts. So that's the need for this user story, right? So what we're trying to do here is, for summary, how nicely can we create it? So like I mentioned here, I'm going to use my own tip here. So I'm going to keep a feature name shortened. So I can call something like account management. You can even keep it like ACCT, MGMT if you want to keep it shortened. And then say hyphen capture account levels, right? Because that's all we are trying to do in this particular story. We will not keep it descriptive because this part of the user story is not for that. Like I mentioned, it's like a name. It's basically to distinguish your user story from the rest, right? So just keep it short and crisp. The second part, which is more essential because it's the value statement, is your description of the user story. So the description of the user story essentially contains three parts. So first one is as a what user. So your persona comes into play. And then the second part is I want to, which is your action, right? What are you trying to act upon in this particular user story? So that is where the why part comes into play, the benefit of this particular story itself, right? So I'm going to again give you an example here with the same use case that we discussed. So for I was mentioning that there's an account management user story and we want to capture the account levels. So how do we write this as the user story using these three essential parts? So as an account executive, right? So I'm trying to say who the persona is here. It's the role, an account executive. I want the ability to capture the levels which my accounts belong to. So that's my action. So what I'm trying to achieve in the story is I'm trying to capture the levels which my account belongs to, right? So what is the benefit for me? So that I can understand the relationship levels with my customer, right? So what kind of relationship level I have with my customer? Is it a platinum level? Is it a bronze level? Is it a silver level? That's what I'm trying to achieve. So this is how you describe this particular use case as a user story, right? With three essential parts. Keep it simple and concise. It's very important. Don't give too much details on your user story. Anything that is not irrelevant or not important, please do not include it. Focus only on what is important. Do not give anything for, if it could be an additional information, but if it doesn't add value to this particular user story, you don't need it. For instance, what you could add here, like as you start grooming this user story, you will start realizing, you want some more information. For instance, here in my account levels, in case if I have not asked my customer, what are your account levels, right? So those are going to be my values. So I can add, a next note saying that, okay, account values are going to be platinum, silver, bronze, or gold, right? I can add all these as my values. And if there should be something defaulted, then I can also include that in my notes. So focus on what is important, keep all the important information, but if something is not very important or it's irrelevant to your particular user story, avoid it. So moving on, the third part of the user story, like I mentioned, is the acceptance criteria. So acceptance criteria is where we define a set of conditions to be fulfilled, right? So if you remember, I was also talking earlier about the invest criteria where I said T stands for testable, right? So the acceptance criteria, whatever conditions that we write here, it should be testable statements. One of the tip, again, it's my own personal, based on my own experiences, have 3 to 5 acceptance criteria for a user story. Try to refrain from having more than 5 acceptance criteria. That's actually a warning that probably you have a very bigger user story or a slightly bigger user story, and maybe you want to think about breaking the stories into smaller ones. So again, a tip from me is keep 3 to 5 acceptance criteria for your story. Again, another easier way to write your acceptance criteria is have 3 parts as part of your acceptance criteria. One is given, which is your initial condition. Say, for example, in our use case, the initial condition is given that the logged in user is an account executive. So that's what we were trying to see, right? So given is your initial condition. So after that comes the when part. What is the action that is being carried out, right? And the third part is the then part, which is your result that we are trying to be obtained, right? So this is what we are going to test, whether the result is coming as pass or fail. So they are the testable statements. So for my particular use case, I can say that given that the logged in user is an account executive, I want the ability to view the account levels on my account. So that could be one of the acceptance criteria, right? The next acceptance criteria could be, given that I'm an account executive, when I try to, so we could have multiple paths to this particular user story. One, an account executive wants to view the account level. Another, an account executive wants to update the account levels, right? And then there's also another part to this user story. If you remember, in the user story definition, we were saying only for my accounts. So what we are trying to say is, if I'm not the account owner, I should not be able to update the account levels. So these are the possible scenarios that needs to be tested, correct? So my acceptance criteria needs to have all these 3 as the acceptance criteria statements involved. So given that I'm an account executive, when I try to view my accounts, I should be able to see the account levels. Same, given that I'm an account executive, when I try to update the account levels, then I should be able to make changes to my accounts. Another one saying, given that I am not an account executive, say I'm an account manager, then I try to update the account levels of an account that does not belong to me, then I should not be able to update my accounts. So these could be your possible acceptance criteria for this particular use case that we discussed. So now let's make it a little bit more interesting, and I want to hear all your inputs here. So we're going to look at scenarios and action. So now that I explained what are the 3 typical parts of a user story and what we need to put in summary, what we need to put in description and acceptance criteria, I would like to know from you all, what do you think are the key details that you would include in the description of a user story if your story is about a new field? Imagine we are having a use case where we are trying to capture a new detail on a particular object, like opportunities or leads or whatever, right? So if your story is about capturing some new information, so what are the key details you would expect to be part of the description and the user story? What do you think is needed and important for this user story? Go ahead and put it in the chat. There is no wrong answers. Go ahead and say what you feel like, because projects are different, situations are different, so your thoughts are more than welcome. So I see data type, field label, access to which users, awesome. Any validation involved, perfect. Placement or the location of the field, awesome. Who can use this field? The object name, field name, data type, field description, help text, FLS. That's a lot of great information. Help text. And yeah, Ankit, thank you. You've given me the user story details as well. Field name, field visibility, validation, layout information. What is the purpose of the field? Module details. What is covered as part of ASIS and whatnot. Okay. All right. So thank you. Thank you for all the great inputs. You kind of made my job much easier because you've pretty much covered a lot of information I wanted to tell. So if your story is about capturing some new information, typically you would look for field label, like what are we going to call this particular field, what kind of information it's going to capture, the field type, because you want to know whether it's going to be a pick list or whether there should be multi-select or a single select or just a text, whatever, right? So all that details. And the location, like you rightly mentioned, where should this field typically go in the page, right? Which section or which part of the page it should go into. Your screen or page layout information is very much required. In case you want to know also attributes like, if this field is required for everybody, should it be read only, should it be editable, and your FLS typically, how your field level security is going to be handled for this new information. And in case, just to add a little bit more complexity, if in case the data for this particular field is going to come from a different system, or if you need to send this data to a different system from Salesforce, right? You want to capture all that information as well. So necessarily what might happen is if there is integration or more complexity involved, the story gets broken down into multiple parts. But as we groom this particular story, which is for the new information collection on the screen, typically these are the kind of information that we would look for as a team, to start building this particular story, or even to estimate the story, right? Because we need to have all the different information to know how complex the story is. So awesome. Thank you so much for your inputs there. Now let's look at a different scenario. Tell me, what are the details that you would include in description if your story is about a business process or a workflow, right? If it's about an opportunity business process or some other business process, for instance, or workflow, what kind of details you would look to be included in description? Go ahead and key your inputs in the chat. The inputs, when to fire, what are the conditions on what object? Awesome, Vijay, thank you for that. What are the inputs that changes that move the business process from one stage to the another? Thank you, Jade, that's an awesome input. Positive, negative flow cases, that's a good one from Prasad. Values, purpose, connected record type, what the automation must accomplish and should not. Object, criteria to fire, workflow name, purpose, conditions, results. From Harini, if then situations, is it invoking other processes? What kind of actions to perform? Awesome. Those are all, again, a great bunch of inputs. And like I said, you're making my life more easier. So typical inputs, like you all mentioned, just to kind of collate all information together, right? If it's involving a business process or a workflow, we would try to include the success pattern. We would like to include the failure pattern. If there is any exceptions, and how do we handle those exceptions? Those kind of details also get included. And what triggers the process or the workflow itself, right? There's some triggering points of what that is, and what are the actions needed. And if in case it's a bigger flow, which most likely most of us would face at some point in our programs, right? So sometimes the process is much bigger or the flow is much bigger. So then always remember to break down into smaller chunks and smaller user stories, right? Thanks again. So let's move on and look at one more last one before we move from this slide. So tell me what you would include in the description if your story is about an approval process. What kind of details would you be looking for if the story is about approval process? The criteria, thank you, Apurva. Users involved, entry criteria. Thank you, Vijay. Conditions for approvals, approvers, what happens after the approval, the object name, criteria, levels, approvers, and when the process will invoke, the final approval action, rejection criteria, final rejection action, what triggers the approval, who can approve, what happens after. These are all, again, great inputs. Delegated manager, approval levels. I also see another input from Vijay, object criteria, initial actions, success actions, reject actions, record locking, final action, rejection, and approval. Awesome. Thank you so much again for all the great inputs. Just to sum up what you all said and to add my inputs as well. So if your story is about an approval process, and what you typically look for in your description is all scenarios that would trigger the approval process itself, then how is it expected to work, right? That could be single level, there could be multiple level, like you all mentioned, and all that needs to be included, the approvers, the levels of approvals, how they are notified, right? So how do they know they have to approve this particular request? Are we notifying them in Salesforce, or should we send an email to them, right? All that. SLA for approval. That's one thing I did not pretty much see in the chat, but I wanted to include that as well. The SLA for approval. And also, like, do we need any auto approvals, right? Sometimes we need to, just for the SLA, like if it's beyond a particular point, you want to auto approve this request. And like you mentioned, there could be, like, if there's a reject scenario, then the rejection reasons or the rejection scenario itself needs to be included. Thank you again for all the great inputs. Now we will move on to the next slide, which is pretty much interesting to know. So these are typically the user story pitfalls we should avoid. So just take a minute to read this user story and tell me what you feel about this user story. Do you feel, is this user story structured well, or do you think this story lacks something, or what is your feeling about this user story? So I'm going to read out this user story to make it a little easier. So as a Salesforce user, I want the ability to click on a button, products by family, to filter products based on product family, right? And report on products by family so that I can quickly search and report on products, right? So this is the user story I have on my screen here. Take a minute to read and tell me, what do you feel about this user story? Do you feel this user story is good enough? Do you feel it is lacking some information, or you feel it's like overloaded? What is your thought? Okay, I'm seeing Sai Manoj says better to build custom component, LWC RO component. All right, you're already designing. I get that. Vijay says missing user info. Murali says it's overloaded. Perfect. And then Parvati says it looks good for her. Saurabh says user specification, it should be Salesforce rep or something specific. That's a good point. Jade says it's lacking information. All right, thank you for all the inputs. And I'm going to just take a deep dive into this and tell you what are all the areas of improvement in this particular user story, right? So the first one that catches our attention is, like you rightly mentioned, it says as a Salesforce user. So always remember the who in your user story, the persona should be a role. It shouldn't be generic, because to me, a Salesforce user could be a sales rep, and to you, it could be a sales manager or anybody. It could even mean everybody who's using Salesforce in the organization, right? It's not exactly telling which specific role. So that's the first area of improvement I see in this user story. It's a Salesforce user and it's very generic, and it should not be generic. Always remember the who should be a role. The second issue I see here is, we say, I want the ability to click on a button, products by family, right? So there is a potential problem here in this statement. I'll tell you, this is very, very important and a common pitfall, and we should definitely avoid this. So what happens, we're all like Salesforce consultants or like Salesforce developers or testers or architects or designers, whatnot, right? So we all know Salesforce very well. So by default, what could happen is while you're gathering information from your customer, you in your head, you're starting to solution. You're already thinking, hey, can I put a button? Can I put a custom link? Can I do this? Can I do that? Right? You are not understanding the problem from the user's perspective. Rather, your head is already getting a step ahead and start solutioning, right? So this is a major pitfall, and that should be definitely avoided. So a story should only be written from an end user's perspective. So put yourselves in the user's shoe. Always remember, if you're a person who's writing a user story, who's creating user stories, right? If you're a product owner, then always ensure that you write the story from a end user's perspective, right? That's why we call it as a user story. It's actually the end user's story, right? You should always communicate the problem to solve and not the solution to deliver. And I'm going to tell you what the problem is. Say, for example, if someone reads this user story from the development team, what's going to happen is they're going to just go ahead and click add a button, right? Most likely that's what it's going to happen. However, there could be a different ways of achieving this. We could use a search filter, for example, right? We have an out-of-the-box feature to use search filter where you can go ahead and filter products by product family. So it's already a feature that's existing out of the box. You don't even have to create a button for it, right? So there is that problem here, right? You're not allowing the creativity to flow in the team. So never consider solution to deliver when you write stories, right? Because as we groom, as the development team understand the story, they are the people who have the real expertise to come up with the design or the solution, because they have the actual knowledge of Salesforce from a system perspective as well. Sometimes we could think like, changing a field type is so simple. Why don't we just go ahead and create a straightforward user story and just put it in there? But what might happen is that field might already be integrated with some other system. There could be flows or process builder or something complex already running on top of it. There could be some limitations in particular solution and whatnot, right? So always remember, when you create user stories, never solution it. Leave it to the development team and let them come up with your shared expertise and come up with their knowledge of the system, let the creativity flow in the team and let them come up with the solution. When you create user story, do not write the solution, just communicate the problem to solve. This is very important because you remember we were talking about all the values and principles of Agile yesterday and how the mindset should work. And we said we want the teams to be transparent and we want them to communicate and collaborate. They are self-managing team. They have different skill sets, right? So we should always allow the conversation before implementing a solution. So this is the second area of improvement I see in this story, right? Moving on, there is the next one here. If you look at this particular story, there are two different objectives, right? One, we're talking about searching products by family, while immediately we're also talking about reporting on a product family, right? So they are basically two different objectives. So this particular story can be split into two different stories because you could realize business value sooner and faster, if you remember well, because maybe it's important for the customer to search the products by family and it's not so important to report immediately. So, you could just break them into two stories and deliver one early because they can already start realizing the value. And then later you could do the reporting piece of it as well, right? So this story includes two objectives. So that is another pitfall. And finally, I'm not sure how many of you noticed this. So there is this part in the that part, the benefit statement, right? So that I can quickly search and report on products. What is the problem here? We're just saying I want to quickly search, right? So what's the problem? Really, is there a problem? Yes. Quickly is a very relative term. We should try to avoid such terminologies in the user story because quickly could mean 60 seconds to me. It could mean 30 seconds to Amit. It could mean, say, 4 seconds to Jade and something lesser to someone else, right? So we need to ensure that keep the user stories measurable. So instead, do not say quickly search, try to have a measurable statement instead there. So now that I've told what are all wrong with these user stories or where there are areas of improvement rather, let me also show you how we could have written this story better. So like I mentioned, I'm going to break this into two because there are two different objectives. So now let's read this and see if it makes better sense. So the first part reads, as a sales representative, I want the ability to search products by product family. Well done, because we have called out the role specifically, sales rep, and I've also called out just the problem to solve and not the solution. I want the ability to search products by product family. I don't care if the best solution is clicking on a button or clicking on a link or a search filter. You guys figure out and come back and tell me. My problem is I'm not able to search through the product catalog. I have a huge product catalog. I need to scroll through a ton of them to get to my products. I want the easier way of searching products by family. Now, look at the so that part of it, right? So that I can filter my products in less than 40 seconds. So we have made it more measurable. So look at the change we have done to the older user story and how we have come up with a newer one, which is now much more falling into the invest criteria. And it's easy to understand. It's very clear and specific, right? Now let's look at the second story we created because we broke them into two. Second one says, as a sales representative, I want the ability to report on products by product family so that I can review my products by family. It's pretty simple and straightforward, right? All we are trying to do is we are trying to have the ability to filter reports based on the product family, right? So this is very important, and this information always keep in your mind that these are usual pitfalls we fall into and they are to be avoided. Just moving on, I just want to wind up this particular user story creation with an example, right? So here is an example that I've come up with. So here the summary says sales process in square brackets because it's a feature name, capture region on opportunities. Also the use case here is we want to capture region on our opportunities, right? So the description, like I mentioned earlier, your value statement, it has three parts. So as a sales representative, that's the role we are trying to evaluate this user story against. I want the ability to capture the regions of my opportunity so that I can view and manage my opportunities by region. Pretty straightforward, right? And then I have also included a note here, like the values which the region should hold, right? So it has EMEA, North America, LATAM, and APAC. That's my customer's region, and I want these regions on my opportunities. Moving on, acceptance criteria. Again, it has three parts. These are the testable statements. So basically, you can test each of these statements and tell me it's a pass or a fail, right? So I've said, like, given that I'm a sales representative, when I view my opportunities, I should be able to see the region to which my opportunity belongs to. And the second one says, given that I'm a sales representative, when I edit my opportunities or update my opportunities, I should be able to update the region on my opportunities, right? So these are the acceptance criteria in this particular user story. So this is again a typical example of a user story. Like I mentioned earlier, your formats could be different based on your organization and tools. It's fine if you want to keep your summary format differently, but ensure your description and acceptance criteria pretty much looking like this, which has key information involved. Moving on, let's get to our tools, right? So I just quickly touched upon this yesterday, and I want to elaborate on this today. So there are multiple tools to make the agile project management successful, right? So starting from your building your backlog to still delivering business value to your customers, there are tons of tools available in the market. Jira is one of the very famous tools that most of the customers use. I have seen people using Trello, Microsoft TFS, Asana, and many others as well, right? So these tools are technically to plan your backlog, track all the items, you report and release basically great software products. So you could go ahead and create your epic features and your user stories in these tools. You could go ahead and assign them to releases. You could include your estimation of your story points. You could break them down into tasks when you're at your sprint, planning meeting. You could have daily stand-ups, you could have reports, your burn up, burn down charts. All these are available in most of these tools. So they are basically to make your life much easier and everything organized in one place. So things are not scattered in Excel sheets, emails, and whatnot, right? So it's all organized in one place. And these are like mostly have the end-to-end solution for your program management needs. And one thing I want to emphasize on here is whatever tool you may use, right? These are not replacement for your individuals and interactions. If you have read the Agile Manifesto, like I recommended yesterday, you will see this there, individuals and interaction over processes and tools. It's very, very important that we focus on individuals and interaction. Processes and tools are important. It's not that it's not important, but what's more important is the individuals and interactions. So do not make your tools replace that. It should only enable your individuals and interactions, the value more easier, right? It should not make, it's not a replacement, rather it's just to make sure that the path is successful. So moving on, now that we talked about how do we create user stories in the Scrum way, let's look at how do we prioritize the user story that we have created. So what usually happens is this task is done by the product owner in collaboration with the executive stakeholders or end user, whoever he or she is closely interacting with this for the product backlog, right? So what the product owner tries to do is he or she tries to arrive at something called a minimum viable product, MVP. You would have heard this term several times. And what an MVP typically means is what is that minimum thing that your customer needs, which can deliver high business value? They cannot live without those items. So what is that? What is that very critical piece for your customer? That's what MVP is all about. So how do we arrive at that, right? How do we prioritize stories or features for that matter? So what the product owner does is he or she separates the product backlog items into 4 buckets, right? So the product owner goes through each and every user story and tries to use something called as the Moscow analysis. What it stands for is must have, should have, could have, won't have. So what do these typically mean? So when I say a user story is a must have, it means it's absolutely essential for my customer. It has a high business value. It's totally not negotiable. It's critical for the success of my customer, right? So that's what must have means. If my story is a must have, after I discuss with the stakeholder, I understand it's a must have, then I mark it as a must have story. The next is a should have. When do you pick that? As if your story is important, but not absolutely essential, and it's of high priority. It is of high priority, but it's not like absolutely essential. It's not the topmost priority for your customer. Then it's like should have, right? Because it's important and it has high value. It's just not that's so essential, right? And the next one is a could have. So could have, what it means is a user story is a nice to have user story. It has business value and it is desirable, right? It's nice to have, but it's not a must or should have. The final one is the won't have, right? So when you say your user story is won't have, what it means is the story is not so important for a release and can be implemented later, right? It's not of a higher business value. It doesn't matter really if it doesn't go in this release. You can wait and work on it later, right? So that's when you put your story or a feature into won't have. So how do we arrive at this? You cannot just go and ask your customer directly, hey, tell me whether I should put it in must, should, could, or won't, right? That's not how we do it. We have to collaborate with the customer to understand and consider a few things to arrive at these particular prioritizations. So one of the key things to consider is the business value. So how much value is your user story being translated to for your customer, right? Is it a high business value? Is it a medium value? Sometimes there is no value at all. Then you have to really think, do I even need this user story, right? So the business value is something that we first consider. The second one is the dependency. Does this story or a feature have dependency with another product backlog item, right? Is it dependent on something else? Do I need to implement something else for me to pick this user story? So that kind of dependency is also considered while arriving at the priority. Also, something else we consider is a solution approach. If there is any prerequisites or a dependency that should be taken care of before you could implement, you could start working on a particular feature or a user story, if there is any risk involved. I'll give you an example here. So I was mentioning this yesterday as well. So say, for example, your customer has a fresh Salesforce implementation. They have never used Salesforce before. And per their priority, their first feature of priority is case management. Their second feature is building knowledge articles. Their third, they have a third feature, which is more of chatter and communication channels, right? So these are the three features that are being marked as MVP, like 1, 2, 3. Like this is a case management is my topmost. The next is my knowledge, and the third is my chatter. If this is your order of priority that the customer has requested for, as a product owner, I need to educate the customer that, hey, I know these are your priorities, but there's something that we need to do from a Salesforce perspective before we go ahead and do these items, which is setting up your org. Because I need to educate the customer saying, this is very important for your security and compliance. I need to understand what profiles, what roles are being involved in your organization, who all need to be set up in the organization, what other organizational setup I need to do. So this needs to be a feature in my backlog. I know it doesn't directly translate to a business value to you. However, in order for your other features to be successful and of high business value, this particular feature is needed. So then what happens is, if you looked at it, the 1, 2, 3 quickly jumped into my org setup became 1 and the remaining became 2, 3, and 4. So that's how we start discussing each item, considering all these considerations that I've mentioned here, and then arrive at the prioritization. Moving on. So now we have product backlog items created. Now we know how to prioritize them. How do we estimate these stories, right? When I'm saying story estimation, I'm talking about the user story estimation. I'm totally not talking about task estimations. We covered task estimation in length yesterday, right? So that's different. That the topic I'm trying to cover here is how do we estimate user stories? So you are in a backlog grooming call. Your product owner, he or she tries to explain what the story is all about, the value it's trying to deliver, and gives you all the essential details you need. You are technically asking a lot of questions. Wherever you need clarification, your product owner is helping you with all the clarifications he or she is aware of, right? So how do you estimate user stories? So again, different organizations do this differently. Some also do without estimations, but let's go with the majority and tell you like how the sizing works, right? The unit for sizing is called story points. You would be hearing USP, user story point. They will say 3 USP, 5 USP. So it stands for user story points. And what concept we follow is something called as a relative sizing, right? I'm going to give you a quick example here to make you understand what relative sizing is. So if my team, we are same team working again and again on multiple sprints. So the smallest story we have ever handled is a field label change on one particular page layout, right? So they were going to change the region to zone. So we had to just get away of the field label and change, nothing else changed in that particular story. So that was a story that we have ever worked on, which was the smallest, and that was estimated like a 1 story point, right? So now I take this as my user story. When I say I am in the entire team, this is our base story, because as a team, we have delivered this user story earlier, and this has been our lowest story point. So this becomes our base story. And what we try to do is something called as a relative sizing. So the new story, whichever we are trying to size, we try to assess it against this particular base story and see how complex it is in relation to that base story. Is it a higher complexity? Is it a medium complexity? And when I say complexity, I'm talking about the functional and technical complexity here, right? So when you read a user story, you try to understand the complexity of the user story. It's very evident from that, right? So you try to assess how complex is this with relation to your base story. So that's one of the main considerations you look for. The next main thing, and the most important thing, I say this here because it is highly misunderstood. And it's again a pitfall that we all get to stumble upon. So this is the magnitude of work. And I'm saying magnitude of work. I'm not saying time which is involved, right? And I'll tell you what's the difference here. When I say magnitude of work, we are talking about the effort involved. Is it a huge effort? Is it a medium effort? Is it a smaller effort? Why we should not consider time, and I see this a lot of times, that a lot of people, the moment you say estimate user stories, many of us, what we might do is, oh, this user story might take 3 hours, so maybe I should give it a 2 story point. This might take 5 hours, so probably this is a 3 story point. We try to immediately, our head, we're so used to that kind of relationships, right? So like, we always try to think, when we look at it, how much time will it take? So do not do that, and I'm going to tell you why. So say, for example, you're estimating stories. You are doing this during your backlog grooming, right? This is part of your backlog grooming. You do not know who is going to work on the story. You do not know who is going to build this one, right? That we are not at all at that stage. We are just looking at the stories, understanding and estimating. So say, for example, I'm a junior developer, right? I mean, something could be like 4 hours for me, but Amit is very senior, he's an expert in his area, so he might only take half an hour to finish this particular user story, right? So what you see here is, it depends, the time actually depends on who is going to work on it, which is not known at the time of your estimation. So time is involved during task estimation, not during your story estimation. So while you estimate story, look at the complexity, look at the magnitude of work, how big an effort or small an effort in relationship to your base story is. Say, for example, you're working on a business process user story. How big an effort is it in compared to changing a field label on a particular page layout, right? That is the kind of comparison we need to do. We also need to look at any risks involved, any dependencies or uncertainties involved, right, in a particular user story. So like I mentioned, if there is an integration piece involved in this particular user story, that means there is a dependency. If you do not get a particular data from your integration team, you're kind of stuck and you're going to be delayed, right? So there is that kind of uncertainty, risk, and dependency involved. So then definitely consider that while you're estimating a story, right? A user story could just be like pulling data from one system and then displaying it in Salesforce. It could seem very simple to you. You might think, okay, maybe I should just estimate it for a smaller story point. But later, if you do not include the risk, dependence, and uncertainty, what's going to happen is there definitely is going to be a delay, right? It's much more complex and it's much more risky because you're dependent on a different team. What if they don't give you the data? What if you're not getting the data in time? What if the integration fails? So there are those kind of uncertainties because you've not done this, right? So all that needs to be considered while you are estimating the user stories. And some of the estimation values I've mentioned here, a lot of people use t-shirt sizing at a very primitive stage when you do not have too much information and you want to size for whatever reasons, and you go ahead and say this is extra small, this is small, medium, large. Again, you use the same relative sizing technique, and many use the Fibonacci series, right? So you say like 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13 kind of story points. So that's how we say the user story points. So moving on, I'm going to just walk you through a story estimation journey that happened in one of my programs. Again, it's not the same user story because it's confidential. I've just made changes. So this was the user story that we were trying to estimate as part of our backlog grooming. So the story is, as a zonal sales manager, I need all new leads to be sent from Marketo to Salesforce and assigned to a queue based on their zone so that the respective zone sales manager can act upon leads. So this is the story. And we had a few people in the room. So we had Karen, who's a product owner. It's a distributor team. She connected from remote. And we had the development team sitting in a room. We had Alex, Jessica, Rob, and Shruti. And we had Kim, the Scrum Master, who was also part of the same room. And they were all working towards estimating this particular story. So Alex, Jessica, Shruti, Rob, all of them read the story. They heard it from the product owner, what the business value was, what we're trying to achieve. They had some questions. They asked Karen all about it. And Karen was so good enough to tell all the details that they needed. So they got enough information on the user story for them to estimate. So they were going to estimate individually. You're not going to call out immediately that, hey, I'm estimating 1, I'm estimating 2, right? So you are estimating it individually without discussing. So Alex came up and told it was 3 user story points. So that's the card he had. Again, he has not announced it yet to the others. And Jessica felt it was 5. Rob felt it was 5 user story points. And Shruti felt it was 8 user story points. So you tell me, what do we do in such situation? There are 4 people in the room, and all of them have a good enough skill set and expertise in their own area. So when you hear 4 different story point estimation for a particular story, what do you think we should do? Should we go with the lowest number? Should we go with the highest estimate? Should we average it out? Or do you think we should do something else? Do you want to quickly pop that in the chat and let me know what you think we should do? Mayank says go with the highest and create subtasks. Basil says voting. And Vijay says ask for why they have given that point. Excellent. Rohit says understand the complexity and understand everyone's point of view. That's awesome. Vijay says we should ask again. And Saurabh says understand everyone's perspective so that if anyone else have something which others haven't thought of. Excellent, right? And Rakesh says you could average it, create tasks, and then decide most voted. Okay, so I'm going to tell you what you should do and what you should not do, right? And thanks all again for the great inputs. So the golden rule, do not go with the lowest or the highest or the average, right? If you remember from yesterday's session, and I really urge you to go and listen to yesterday's session if you were not present yesterday, the agile values and principles, which are the core of all this we are talking about today, right? We want the teams to be transparent. And if you remember, the first point I mentioned in the agile mindset is we welcome different perspectives, the different thoughts and ideas, because we are a self-managing team with different skill sets together as one team, right? So like some of you rightly mentioned, we are not going to average, not going to take the lower, not going to take the higher, right? And certainly we cannot do tasks now, like I just mentioned a couple of minutes back. This happens at backlog grooming stage, where you're just knowing the user story, what it is about, and you're estimating them. The task estimation happens later while you're doing the sprint planning, and based on who is going to pick what. Like I mentioned, something that could be 2 hours for me, could be 4 hours for you, and something else for someone else, right? So what happened in our room? Because this happened in real life, I'm going to tell you what happened in the room. So we started asking each of them for their perspective. Why Alex felt it was 3, why Jessica and Rob felt it was 5, and Shruti felt it was 8. So Alex told us that he felt it was 3 because they had built a similar integrations for orders, the different integration system. But since we've already done this integration once, it should not be complex to build it with the Marketo. So he felt because he has done orders with something else, Marketo with Salesforce should be probably easier, and that's why he feels it's probably 3 story points. It's not too high. Then Jessica and Rob talks about what they feel. Jessica and Rob talks about what they feel, and they say that they have worked in Marketo integrations earlier, and it's totally not like how the order integration was done with a different system. It's a completely different system, different framework. So there's a fair bit of complexity involved, and there are some risks as well. So they thought it is 5 story points, but they also agree the complexity is higher. They don't feel it's medium as what Alex felt, right? But Jessica and Rob were kind of in the same page. And finally, Shruti was talking out, and she was saying she feels it's 8 story points. And she says she agrees with Jessica and Rob that, Marketo integration is different. It's much more complex than how they did orders with Salesforce. However, there is some risks, uncertainties, and dependencies she sees here, which is why she is giving an 8 story point, because she felt Marketo team, they are dependent heavily on that particular team to execute this particular user story, right? So in case something doesn't go well, if something doesn't work well enough, if they're not getting the data that they need, if they're not getting enough support, or if something fails in the integration front, this could become much more complex. Right now, we do not know what will happen when you're trying to build this integration, if it's going to be a happy path or not. So there are some kind of uncertainties there. So she says it should be 8 story points. So they all heard each other's perspective, and there went another round. So, the Scrum Master was asking, what do you feel should be the user story point now that you've heard everyone's perspective? And then everyone in the room agreed to Shruti's 8-story point view, because they all, Alex understood it was not as simple as his orders integration, and it was much more complex. And also Jessica and Rob agreed with the risk, uncertainty, and independency, which Shruti rightly brought in. And they all finally agreed and redid their estimation, and they all came up with 8-story points. Again, it was not because of any influence, or it was not because someone was higher, someone was lower. It was simply because they heard each other's perspective, thoughts, and the expertise that they hold, and then they came up with a consensus among themselves, right? So that's what happened. And I want to tell you, luckily, because it was estimated at 8-story points, it really did happen. If you joined the session yesterday, I did mention about this user story in the journey. It really did happen that there was a bottleneck. So the person was a lead in the market, though he had gone out on an emergency, and there was a delay in getting some data from them. There was a little bit of bottleneck there, and we're finally able to achieve the story. So good that was considered while the story was estimated, and they had estimated it at 8-story point. So here are some quick tips before we wind up the session for today. So while you estimate user stories, the first and foremost rule is understand the user story fully. Ask questions. There is nothing wrong. If you want something to be clarified, just ask. Don't think it is very basic, they might judge you for something. No, we want everyone in the agile to be transparent, right? We are always talking about communication and collaboration. We want to hear everyone's ideas and thoughts, also the questions, right? So ask your product owner all the questions that you need. Imagine if you're going to work on the user story tomorrow, what all information you would probably need, right? Ask all the questions. It's very, very important. Identify your base story. Like I mentioned in my example, our base story was the field label changed, which was the smallest. So identify your base story based on what your team has done. Do not go and pick a base story from some other team, because it's all different, right? Go with your own team. Your base story should be yours. Relatively size the other stories in the backlog based on your base stories. And like I mentioned, reach a consensus among team. Do not go with low, high, or average. Ask everyone's perspective, resize, and come to a consensus. Finally, if your user story is big, right, it's again my tip and recommendation. If it goes beyond 8 user story points, please break it down into smaller user stories. There should always be room to break down user stories. But if it really you cannot break for whatever reason, then try to think, why is it so complex? Why is it so big? If you have enough good reasoning, then that's fine. But I would highly recommend, if your user story is big, if you remember in the invest criteria, we kept saying S stands for small. We want to keep it as small as possible so it can be delivered sooner and faster, right? Break them down into smaller user stories. So here I've just given an example, again, in a very Salesforce world. If a user story is talking about just a field label change, it could be very small versus your field creation. It could be slightly bigger than that, right? It's much more, a little bit more complex, and a little bit, magnitude of work is a little bit higher. But if it's a field creation involving integration with another system, that's probably even a bigger effort, a bigger magnitude of work and bigger complexity, right? So that could be sized at a little higher level. And think about a multi-step approval process. If you have a multi-step approval process user story, then that's probably much bigger compared to your field label change, isn't it? Because it has much more complex, it has more magnitude of work. So these are the typical tips that you need to keep in mind while you're estimating your user stories. So I'm going to open up the room for the Q&A. If you want, you could unmute and ask me questions, or you could drop it in chat, whichever works for you better. But I'm going to drop in more articles, like I mentioned, in salesforcecouple.com, read more. All right, do we have any questions?
Okay, thank you so much for a great session. So I will allow everyone to unmute yourself and ask a question. So please raise your hand and go in the same order. So I see Sagar was there. So Sagar, you can go ahead first, and then Rohit. And if anybody have any question, raise your hand. I will allow you to go in a sequence.
Yep. Thank you, Amit. Thank you, Sudha. First of all, I want to start with saying that it was a really great session. Thank you, Sudha, for sharing your expertise. So I'm a project manager, actually, working in the sales area for quite some time. And it was very refreshing to see that, a lot of concepts he explained were actually, coming from a real-time experience rather than theoretical facts. Now, coming back to my question, so according to you, what do you prefer while estimating? Do you prefer story points or hours? And why would you choose any one of them?
Right. So whenever I say story point estimation, like I mentioned, we are not supposed to consider hours simply because like I mentioned, when you start considering the time involved, right? So when you're doing a story point, you're at a much more primitive stage, right? You're doing the backlog grooming at that point. You're building your backlog items and you have estimates ready so that it can get picked up in the sprints based on its priorities. Only whilst doing the sprint planning, we talk about the hours. So that is also based on who is picking what user story. Just the reason being simply because something that could be like 4 hours for me could be 2 hours for Amit, and it could be like 1 hour for you to complete it, right? So it's very different. So while we're estimating stories, we really do not know who is going to pick what. So really for that reason, we do not consider hours for the story point estimation. I highly recommend you just follow those considerations I mentioned and kind of stick to the user story points itself. If it's a very primitive stage, go with the t-shirt sizing. If not, you can go with the Fibonacci series I mentioned.
Right, perfect. Also, can we get access to the slides in some way?
I'm sorry, I'm unable to share my slides, and because it's interactive session and I do it with different groups, but the recording will be available on the Apex Hours channel, so feel free to revisit whenever you need to.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Rohit, you can go now.
Yeah, thanks, Amit. Thanks for that. So I have a question, like when it comes to estimation, then should testing be also part of it? Or it should just be a solutioning effort that we put in the story points?
Right. So when you do story points, you try to look at the complexity, right? It's both functional and the technical complexity. So if it's like, it's not like testing, development, design, or, those kind of tasks come later in the game, right? So that's when we do the task estimation. We will try to, look at how much time my validation of the scenario will take. How much time will I take to put a field in a particular page layout? How much time will I take to update the field type of a particular field, right? So once you have your solution in place, you break them down into logical tasks. So I mentioned this in my session yesterday as well. If you have not joined yesterday's session, feel free to look at the recording. So we talked about how do we do logical breakdown of tasks. So that is when you actually start breaking them down into how much time it takes for each of it. And I did a recommendation yesterday that do not go ahead and say analysis, design, development, or testing. Rather logically break them down into tasks, meaning like if you were trying to put a field on a particular page, if you want to capture region on your opportunities, talk about like, first creating your field region on a particular page layout. Then if you're trying to do a FLS, if only sales reps need to see, let that be your separate task. Make them very logical. So end of the day, when you look at it, you are also able to confirm that these tasks are needed for me to achieve this particular business value, right? It could also involve validation of your acceptance criteria. They could be your tasks. Right. So use only hours and tasks for your task estimation, not for your story point estimation. Rather, just look from a functional and technical complexity, how smaller or bigger it is to your base story, and also try to see how much effort will be involved, not specifically the time, just try to think, is it bigger effort? Like I showed you in my last slide, your field creation particular story is slightly bigger than your field label. Right, the little bit higher magnitude of work is involved there. So that's what you need to look at, not necessarily the hours involved to create a field. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, Sada. And one more additional question then. Then can we say that the story points are usually the cumulative of all the tasks that are listed down inside the user story?
Not necessarily. They are independent of each other in a way. But I wouldn't say it's totally like separate, because story point estimations Like I mentioned, we are only considering a few factors while we estimate the story, right? So why I'm saying this is, you could see a 3-story point could have a 10 hour of tasks total, right? While a 5-story point could have just 6 hours of task, but it is 5, simply because there could be more risk involved in that particular story, because it's integration. Like I mentioned earlier, if there is any uncertainty or risk, those are also considered while estimating your story points. So I would keep them independent. Don't try to tie them together. A story point could be 3, but you have a junior developer, so he's taking 3-4 hours, where a senior person could take 2 hours. It's fine, right? Your tasks are higher, but your story points, you're not considering any of that. Like I mentioned, you don't even know who's going to work on the particular story when you're actually doing your story point estimation.
Okay, yeah, got that.
So that was slightly confusing. So suppose there is a user story which has 3 subtasks associated to them, right? So what should we do? Like first, estimate the individual tasks, give them a story point, and then give an aggregate number to the user story, or first estimate the user story.
Yeah, so let me tell you this a little bit more clear. I'm sorry if I was not clear earlier. So during the backlog grooming sessions, right, you have these events, Scrum events, right, backlog grooming. That is when we do a story point estimation. You are trying to understand your story and you're trying to estimate your story. You are not doing your task estimations then. So the story that you're sizing might be picked up in the next sprint or the 10th sprint from now. It might not be immediate also, right? So you are not totally, your team could even be different while you're actually picking up that story. So your story estimation is done during your grooming. It is at an early stage. When you do task estimation is only when you do a sprint planning. So assume your sprint starts, you have a prioritized backlog. So you start you start picking up stories for the particular sprint to get your sprint goal, right? So then what we do is we pick up each story and say, I am saying that my expertise is on building flows, for example, right? I'm just throwing stuff up here. So if I see there's a story which involves using flows and building flows, right? So then what I would do is I'll say, hey, I have expertise in this. I'm going and picking up the story. So I start breaking them into individual tasks. Like I mentioned, logical individual tasks, not like analysis, design, development, testing, rather logically, what are the steps for me to build the flow? So I start breaking each task and I start assigning hours against them, right? So end of it, if you sum all the task hours against the user story, you might arrive at the number of hours needed for a particular user story to be done. And like I mentioned, it's independent of your user story points, because user story points is done during your grooming. Your task estimations are done during your sprint planning by the person who has picked up the user story, right? It's very different. And that's exactly why I keep saying, do not consider time when you are estimating a user story. And to reiterate on my example I said earlier, a 3-story point, right, could have 10 hours of work. It could be a straight standalone Salesforce stories. It has 10 hours of work, and there could be a 5 user story point story. It could probably have only 6 hours of work because it is an integration piece. The integration is already built, and your user story, you're just trying to make data flow between for a particular field, if that is your user story. The reason the team would have given a 5-story point here, though you see in the task later when the story gets picked up, it is only 6 hours. It is simply because there is a dependency, risk, and uncertainty involved in terms of integration. So the story is estimated at 5. So it's not wrong to have a lesser task hours on a 5-story point and a more task hours on a 3-story point, right? It depends on the person who is picking it. So like I mentioned, do not tie both. Keep them independent. It happens in different stages in your Scrum project, and it is done from a different perspective also.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Bob, you can go last. So sorry if we are running out of time. So it will be last question. So definitely you can post your question on our recording once it will be available on YouTube. And we will definitely go there and post answer for that. But yeah, we are running out of question. So Bob, you can go now. Last question.
Thank you so much. And it's been a great series from yesterday to today. So very quickly, my question is, I work in an agile hybrid environment, so it's not pure agile. So there's, people use it as they wish. My question is regarding MVP. So there are user stories that are marked, MVP, you must have it for MVP. And then there are items that are post MVP. But if I have enough cycles and I have time, the development team has room to work on these user stories that are post MVP, can I say, pull them up and say, let's work on these since we have time? Like, what do you recommend then before the major release happens? Why not waste, let's do it, right?
Absolutely. That's what Agile is all about, right? So we have a prioritized backlog. And like you mentioned, if you have an MVP, but just because our velocity and capacity, gave us, the room only to pick the first 5 user stories, for example, because we hit either velocity or capacity and we stop picking more user stories. But we're almost at the near end of the sprint. We have 2 more days pending, right? If you feel you can pick another user story which is out of this 5 stories that you already picked from your prioritized backlog, just because you have a room for taking another 2 story point story or a 3 story point story for that matter, when you break them down into tasks, you really fit into the hours remaining, right? So then you can always pick it up, right? There is no rule that you're not supposed to pick more. Agile is all about accommodating changes, right? So we can do that. However, a word of caution: whenever you're trying to pick stories later in the game, try to understand the total amount of time that you will need to build this particular story, and also demonstrate and get approval. Because you need to, if you're building something, one, you need to ensure you're not breaking something that you've already built. So pick something that's not risky, right? If you're just trying to add a help text or change a field name, or just create an additional field, it's fine. You can, if you have time and resource for it, you can do that. But in case if that is something that could break something else, because you're at the near end of the sprint, your user stories are done, tested, reviewed, most of your user stories are done, and ready, right, ready for your deployment, and now you're going to pick something up. So if you're going to break something, then what potentially will happen is that you will have a lot of rework to be done, or end of the day it's going to be pushed to the next sprint because it's not actually ready, right? So try to look at all these parameters while you take it. While you can absolutely pick it up if you have the time and resource for it, but try to look at all these caution points and see that it's a very independent story and it's not much risky, and you can still do it if your team is confident about it. The person who's going to work on it, your development team is confident about it, you can go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.